For more than a decade, Thomas Raleigh had lived alone on the endless plains of eastern Wyoming, where the grass bent like waves in the wind, and the sky stretched so wide it could swallow a man whole. His ranch, a quiet spread of land tucked between two low ridges, was a place forgotten by time. The dirt road that led to it was barely a path anymore, swallowed by weeds and dust. No one came out this far unless they were lost, and even then, few ever found their way back. The silence was thick, nearly sacred, and Thomas preferred it that way. Once, long ago, there had been voices on this land, the laughter of a child, the soft hum of a woman's song drifting from the kitchen, the barking of a dog chasing Jack. But those sounds had vanished like smoke in the wind. His wife, Margaret, and their little girl Anna had both died within the same bitter winter, taken by the fever that swept through the valley like a plague. The doctor had come too late, the medicine even later. After they passed, Thomas buried them on a grassy rise behind the barn, under a cottonwood tree that still shed its leaves like gold coins every fall. The grief hollowed him out. Friends came by, offering help, conversation, even a place to stay, but he turned them all away. He stopped answering letters. He stopped going to town, except for the barest necessities: grain, salt, oil, bullets. He learned to speak only, when needed, and then only to his horses or the old hound who'd outlived its own sadness. Days became routines: up before dawn, coffee in silence, saddle the mare, check the fences, count the herd, mend what needed mending. Nights were long stretches of quiet broken only by the wind or the occasional coyote's call. He didn't keep a calendar anymore. The sky told him what he needed to know. Thomas aged in those years, though he barely noticed it. His hair turned from coal black to steel gray, and the lines on his face deepened like etchings in sandstone. His hands, always rough, grew calloused and cracked, the nails permanently stained from working wood and soil. He was tall and lean, moving with the quiet precision of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, because no one was watching. The only mirror he had was a small one nailed to the back of the pantry door, and he hadn't looked into it in months. The ranch house itself had grown tired, too. The paint peeled in strips from the siding, and the porch steps creaked with every weight, but it stood firm, like its owner, weathered but unbroken. The barn leaned a little, the fences sagged in places, and the windmill screeched on dry bearings, but the land still yielded enough to live. He kept bees for honey, hens for eggs, and 2 cows for milk and meat. A vegetable patch by the kitchen window gave him onions, carrots, and beans when the seasons were kind. In all those years, Thomas had made peace with solitude. He told himself he didn't need anyone, not anymore. People only left. They died, or they betrayed, or they forgot. The land, at least, stayed. The wind never lied. The horses didn't pretend. That was enough. But sometimes, on nights when the moon was too bright, or the storm too loud, or a particular songbird sang outside his window, just the way his daughter once did, Thomas would feel something stirred deep inside him, a longing he couldn't name, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't meant to be lived so completely alone. But he'd shake it off, pour another cup of coffee, and get back to work. It was easier to be useful than to feel, and so, the seasons turned. Years passed, marked only by the rise and fall of the sun, the greening and browning of the grass, and the fading of memories that no longer had anyone to share them. Until one stormy night, when lightning lit up the sky like a warning from heaven, something unexpected arrived at his gate, and everything changed. The day had started like most others, still and quiet. The sky stretched wide in a pale blue dome above the ranch. Thomas Raleigh had saddled his horse just after sunup and spent the morning repairing a section of fence that the elk had knocked over during the night. It was midsummer, and the heat shimmered off the plains like smoke, dry and unrelenting. The birds were mostly silent, and even the cattle gathered near the creek's edge, searching for the faintest breath of coolness. But by midday, something shifted. The wind changed direction. A slow, steady roll out of the northwest, and the air thickened with the scent of rain and something else Thomas couldn't quite place. Ozone dust, maybe, fate. By mid-afternoon, the horizon darkened like bruised flesh. Thick, low clouds pushed in from the west, swallowing the sky in layers of ash and slate. Thunder rolled in the distance, not loud yet, but deep and constant, like a warning drum from some ancient land. The birds had disappeared completely now, and even the insects seemed to pause. The animals felt it too. The horses grew restless in the corral, ears twitching, muscles tense. Thomas ran a gloved hand over the mare's neck and muttered softly, more to her than to himself, "Something's coming." He spent the next hour preparing for the storm. It wasn't unusual in this part of Wyoming for violent weather to roll in fast and hard, especially in summer, but this felt different. More than just a passing squall, the kind of storm that left its mark, not only on the land, but on the soul. He secured the barn doors, covered the chicken coop with a tarp, and brought the hound inside. The sky was now an eerie green, the kind that made the skin crawl, and the air felt alive, like it was breathing, like it was watching. By 6 o'clock, the first drops began to fall, fat and heavy like coins, splattering against the porch. In slow, deliberate rhythm, within minutes the rain turned into a downpour. Sheets of water whipped sideways across the yard, blown by wind that howled like a train barreling across the plains. Lightning forked across the sky in jagged streaks, each bolt followed by a cannon blast of thunder that shook the windows in their frames. Thomas lit 2 oil lamps and set them on the kitchen table, just in case the power flickered. He didn't mind the dark, he'd lived with worse. He made himself coffee, black, hot, and bitter, and stood by the window, staring out into the storm. His fingers curled around the mug, but his mind wasn't in the room anymore. Storms always made him think of Margaret, of how the last storm before her fever came had felt like this. Thick, charged, almost alive. He remembered her standing in the doorway, her dress whipping in the wind, calling him inside with that tired but tender smile. He remembered Anna trying to catch raindrops on her tongue, laughing like she had all the time in the world. He shook, the memories off like dust. No good came from digging them up, but the feeling wouldn't leave him, the sense that something was coming, something beyond just wind and rain. It gnawed at him, coiled tight in his gut. There were nights he had ignored his instincts and regretted it. This wouldn't be one of them. He stepped onto the porch, hat low against the rain, and scanned the property. Lightning cracked across the sky, lighting up the entire valley in a brief, terrifying clarity. The wind pushed hard against his chest, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting it hit him, as if daring the storm to try and take him to. The thunder rolled again, closer now, and the ground felt like it was humming beneath his boots. Then, just as he was about to turn back inside, something moved at the edge of his vision, a flicker, a shadow at the far end of the fence line. He narrowed his eyes. The rain made it hard to see. Another flash of lightning, and this time he saw it, a small figure, hunched low. Stumbling through the mud. He didn't move at first. Couldn't he blinked once, twice, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. But then the figure dropped, collapsed, just outside the gate. And everything inside, Thomas Raleigh snapped awake. The storm howled around him as Thomas Raleigh stared into the darkness beyond his fence. The girl, or what looked like a girl, hadn't moved since collapsing just feet from the front gate. Rain poured down in thick sheets, turning the ground to soup. Thunder cracked again, loud and close, and the lightning that followed revealed her fully this time. She was on her knees, arms hanging limp at her sides, her dress soaked and torn, sticking to her like second skin. Her head hung forward, strands of wet hair clinging to her face. She looked like she'd been through hell, or was still in it. Thomas's first instinct was disbelief. People didn't just appear out here. His ranch was 20 miles from the nearest town, and even that town wasn't much more than a post office and a diner. There were no throw roads, no neighbors close by. No reason for a young girl to be wandering alone, especially not in a storm like this. But she was there, and the way she dropped told him everything he needed to know. Whoever she was, she hadn't come by accident, and she needed help now. Without another thought, he sloshed through the rain, boots sinking into the mud with every step. The wind whipped around him like claws, trying to push him back, but he kept moving. When he reached the gate, he dropped to one knee beside her and gently lifted her chin. Her face was pale, lips blue, and her eyes fluttered weakly, barely able to open. She was young, no more than 15 or 16, with a face streaked in mud and what looked like old bruises. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and when her eyes finally met his, they held no fear, only exhaustion, as if she had run beyond the end of her strength. "Hey," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but he couldn't make out the words. "I'm going to get you inside," he said, shifting to lift her. "Hold on." She made a small sound, half whimper, half groan, and then went limp in his arms. Thomas wasn't a young man anymore, but adrenaline lent him strength. He lifted her easily, cradling her soaked form like a broken bird. She weighed almost nothing, her body light from hunger or sickness, maybe both. He moved fast across the yard, boots pounding through puddles, and kicked open the cabin door with his heel. The warmth of the fire hit them immediately, along with the familiar scent of pine, smoke, and earth. He lowered her gently onto a patchwork rug near the hearth and grabbed every dry blanket he could find, old quilts, flannel sheets, even his own wool coat, piling them over her trembling frame. She was ice cold to the touch. Her fingers were like frost, her cheeks burning with fever. He stripped off her wet shoes, then wrapped her in dry cloths, rubbing warmth back into her hands and arms as best he could. Her breathing was erratic, chest rising too fast, then too slow. For a long moment, Thomas knelt there beside her, staring at the unconscious girl and trying to understand what had just happened. A stranger was in his home. A child, soaked to the bone, half dead at his doorstep, and he had no idea who she was, or who might be following her. The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters like angry fists. He got up, bolted the door, and checked the windows. Nothing but darkness and rain. Still, he didn't trust it. Something about this storm, about her sudden appearance, stirred an old instinct in him. The same instinct that had kept him alive in the years after Margaret and Anna passed, the gut feeling that warned when something wasn't right. He returned to her side and brushed damp hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered again, and this time she spoke, barely a whisper, barely a breath. "Please don't let them find me." Thomas froze. Them. But before he could ask anything, her eyes closed once more, and she sank back into unconsciousness. The fire crackled beside them, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, something deeper had begun to stir. A stranger had come to his gate, and with her, she had brought a mystery that would not let him go. The fire hissed and popped as rain continued to pound the windows, but inside the small cabin, time seemed to still. Thomas Raleigh sat in his worn leather chair, hunched forward, staring at the unconscious girl wrapped in blankets before the hearth. The storm outside had not let up. If anything, it had grown fiercer. Wind howled like wolves beyond the shuttered windows, and lightning cracked in the distance, casting sharp, momentary shadows across the cabin walls. But the girl's breathing, faint and uneven, was all he could hear. He'd dried her off, as best he could, using an old towel and some of Margaret's forgotten linens, still folded neatly in the cedar chest despite the years. Her clothes were torn and stained, not just from mud, but from something darker, redder. Blood, he realized, dried and dark on the edges of her sleeve and at the hem of her dress. He hadn't seen any fresh wounds, which meant she'd been hurt before she arrived and had traveled a long way in that state. Her skin was hot now, the way fever burns through the body like fire through dry grass. He touched her forehead again and frowned. Too warm, much too warm. He fetched a small basin, filled it with cool well water, and soaked a cloth. Gently, he laid it across her brow and sat back, watching her shiver beneath the quilts. She was fragile, a storm-broken creature, but beneath that frailty, he sensed something else, some flicker of steel. She had survived something terrible. Though much was clear, he hadn't shared his home with another soul in years. Not since the night Margaret and Anna left this world and took most of his heart with them. Since then, this cabin had become more than shelter. It was a shell, a cocoon, a hiding place. The quiet had been comforting, predictable. No surprises, no loss, no one to bury. But now, the rhythm of that quiet had been shattered by a single knock at the gate, or rather, by the thud of a girl falling to her knees in the mud. Thomas sighed and rubbed his face with calloused hands. He couldn't ignore this, couldn't turn her away. He wasn't that kind of man, no matter how much he'd tried to harden himself. She hadn't come here for charity. She hadn't come for food, or shelter, or protection, not knowingly. At least, she had simply collapsed where her strength failed her. And now, whether he liked it or not, she was his responsibility. He stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, though it had long gone cold. He drank it anyway, bitter and black, his eyes never leaving the girl. Her hair soaked, tangled, and matted with leaves and dirt, reminded him of Anna when she used to play in the orchard, always coming home with sticks in her curls, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. But this girl didn't look like she'd been playing. She looked like she'd been running for her life. He'd seen bruises like that before, years ago, on the face of a neighbor's wife who'd shown up with a split lip and a trembling voice. He'd helped her quietly, gave her food, a blanket, and a wagon to get away. People in these parts didn't like outsiders interfering in family matters, but Thomas never could stand by when someone was hurting. Not then, not now. The girl stirred suddenly, a faint murmur leaving her cracked lips. He crouched down beside her, gently holding the cloth to her forehead again. Her eyes fluttered, a flicker of gold brown beneath heavy lids, and then closed again. "You're safe now," he muttered, unsure if she could hear. "No one's gonna hurt you here." The words surprised even him. It had been a long time since he'd spoken with tenderness, a long time since he'd even had a reason. As night deepened, he stayed beside her. The cabin was warm, lit by firelight and soft shadows, but something else filled the room. Something unfamiliar. Not fear, though that lingered somewhere in the back of his mind. Not regret, though it always rode with him like a saddle. No, it was something quieter. A stirring. She had brought more than just mystery to his doorstep. She had brought back the feeling of purpose, of life. And as the storm raged on outside, Thomas Raleigh realized that the silence he'd wrapped himself in for over 10 years had finally been broken. It was nearly dawn when the girl finally stirred for more than a few seconds. Thomas had been sitting beside her the entire night, dozing in and out in the old rocker by the fire. He hadn't slept much, not deeply, not with someone else. Under his roof for the first time in over a decade, every creak of the windmill outside, every groan of the wind against the eaves made his shoulders tense. But the fire had held steady, and the warmth of the cabin kept the worst of the fever at bay. She made a sound, a weak cough, followed by a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Thomas was at her side in seconds, kneeling on the rug, leaning in close. "You're awake," he said gently. "You made it through the night." Her eyes opened slowly, flickering as if unsure of what they were seeing. They were deep brown, not soft, but watchful, the kind of eyes that had seen too much in too little time. She tried to sit up, but her limbs failed her. He caught her shoulders. "Easy," he said, "you're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you here." She looked around, dazed. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. Where am I?" "My place," he answered, keeping his voice low. "Out past Bitter Ridge. He collapsed at my gate during the storm." Her brow furrowed. "The storm you walked through it," he said, "or ran. I don't know how you made it this far." She looked down at herself, then at the quilts wrapped tightly around her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the blanket. I didn't know where I was going. Just away." "From what?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked into the fire, her expression darkening, hardening. The room fell silent again, except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the steady whisper of rain easing outside. He tried again. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice that carried more pain than years ought to allow, she said, "Clara." Thomas nodded. "Clara, that's a strong name." She looked at him warily, still unsure whether he could be trusted. He didn't blame her. Trust wasn't something you gave easily. Not in this world, and not after whatever had driven her into the storm. "I'm Thomas Raleigh," he said, settling back on his heels. "This is my land. Been out here a long while." Clara studied him, her eyes lingering on his weathered face, the graying beard, the deep lines that carved his brow. "Why'd you help me?" He looked away for a moment, gathering the words. "Because you were dying on my doorstep," he finally said. "Because someone needed to. Because once someone should have helped my family, and they didn't." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than he expected. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, the color still not returned to her cheeks. Thomas stood and poured her a small tin cup of water from the pitcher on the table. He held it out, and she took it with trembling hands, sipping carefully. After a few moments, she cleared her throat. "They'll come looking for me," she said, voice hoarse. "They always do." He froze. "Who?" Clara shook her head. "Bad men. They kept us locked up. Me and others. A farm, but not the kind that grows food. Just pain." Thomas's jaw clenched. "We're west," she whispered. "About 4 days' walk, maybe more. I ran when I saw the fence gate left open. I didn't think, I just ran." He looked toward the window, where the sky was beginning to lighten behind streaks of gray clouds. His instincts had been right. She hadn't wandered here by chance. She'd escaped something cruel, something wicked, and if she was telling the truth, she hadn't come alone. Her past was catching up, step by step, with mud on its boots and violence in its hands. "You're not going back," Thomas said firmly. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not fear this time, but something close to disbelief. Hope. And in that quiet, flickering moment by the firelight, a bond began to form. Fragile, yes, like a sapling in the wind, but rooted in something deeper. Two people, broken by the world in different ways, had found each other in the middle of nowhere, and neither of them would ever be the same. By the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the land soaked and quiet. The storm clouds drifted east, thinning into gray streaks against a pale sky. The ground outside the cabin squished underfoot, and the prairie beyond the fence looked like a painting washed in wet colors, soft browns, olive greens, and the muted yellow of waterlogged grass. But Thomas wasn't admiring the view. He was staring down at something that made his blood run cold. Boot prints. They weren't his. He knew every pattern of his worn soles, every notch in the leather. These prints were larger, deeper, and fresher than anything he had left behind. They trailed from the edge of the road, if it could be called that, down toward the creek that curved around the back of the property, then disappeared into the reeds. There were at least 3 distinct sets, maybe 4. Some of them had heel drags, like someone had been limping or carrying weight. Whoever they were, they had come close, too close, and had either chosen not to approach the cabin, or worse, had planned to return when no one expected them. Thomas crouched, running his fingers over the indentations in the mud. They were hours old, maybe from before dawn, which meant they had come during the storm, or just after it ended. Either way, they weren't passing travelers. Nobody wandered out here without reason, especially not in the middle of the night. During a flood-soaked thunderstorm, his mind immediately went back to what Clara had said. They always come looking. He straightened, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing moved except the grass and a lone hawk circling high above. Still, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He hadn't felt like this in years, not since the war. Not since he had to sleep with one hand on a rifle and the other on his brother's shoulder. That old instinct, once buried beneath seasons of silence, came roaring back like a freight train back in the cabin. Clara was asleep again, curled under the patchwork quilt on the cot he'd set up near the hearth. Her fever had broken slightly during the night, but she was still too weak to move around much. He didn't want to worry her yet. Not until he had something more than tracks in the mud. Thomas quietly opened a small chest near the back wall. Inside lay a rifle wrapped in oiled cloth, 2 boxes of ammunition, and a revolver that hadn't been fired in years. He checked the action, loaded it with practiced hands, and slung it over his shoulder. The rifle, heavier and slower, but deadly. From a distance, he leaned near the door. He didn't plan on starting a fight, but if one came, he'd be damned if it ended at his cabin door. After locking the front and back entrances, he walked the perimeter of his property, boots sinking in the wet ground. He followed the trail until it vanished beyond a copse of cottonwoods. The earth here had dried faster, and the prints ended abruptly, a sign they may have mounted horses, or had someone picked them up. Still, they had gotten far too close. And the message was clear. They were hunting her. He returned to the cabin just before midday and found Clara sitting up, pale but alert. Her eyes immediately went to the rifle in his hand. "You saw something?" she said. He nodded slowly, setting the weapon aside. "Tracks at least 3 men. They didn't knock." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing, but her hands balled into fists beneath the quilt. "They were close?" she asked. "Too close," he said. "They knew where they were going." Clara swallowed hard. "Then they found the road. The one near the creek. I thought I lost them there." "You did," he said. For now, a heavy silence followed. For a girl so young, Clara carried the weight of someone much older, someone who'd survived things that left scars no one could see. Thomas sat across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "I can get you out," he said. "Wagons? Still good. You could ride north. Maybe find a town that'll help you start over." She looked at him, startled. "You'd send me away." He met her gaze, steady and calm. "I'd never send you anywhere you didn't want to go. But you're not safe here. Not if they know where to look." Clara hesitated. Then she shook her head. "If I run again, they'll follow. They always do. But if I stay, maybe for once, they'll see I'm not alone." Thomas stared at her, and for a moment, he saw a glimpse of the fire behind her tired eyes. Not just fear, but the beginning of defiance. He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." For the next 3 days, the prairie held its breath. The rain had passed, but the air remained thick with moisture and unease. A slow mist rolled across the lowland each morning, clinging to the long grass like ghosts. Thomas moved quietly across his land, always watching, not just for the return of those strangers, but for signs that the peace he had built in isolation was truly gone. Inside the cabin, Clara slowly regained her strength. The fever had broken for good, and her eyes were clearer now. She still moved like someone expecting to be chased, flinching at sudden sounds, glancing toward the windows too often, but there was a shift in her posture, a subtle return of something long buried, resolve. Thomas had given her space. He knew better than to push. Some wounds didn't heal just because a roof was overhead or a fire was warm, but he kept the fire going, made fresh coffee, even dug through old trunks for clothes Margaret had once worn. Clara had accepted them, with a quiet nod and a soft thank you, then retreated behind the curtain he'd hung to give her privacy. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words came like water breaking through a dam, halting at first, but then pouring out. "There were others," she said, "one evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange behind the ridge. Girls like me, some younger, some broken in ways you don't come back from." Thomas didn't press her for details. He just listened. "They called it a farm," she continued, "but it was a prison. No fences, just threats. If you tried to leave, they'd drag you back. Or worse." She didn't say what worse meant, but she didn't need to. Thomas's jaw tensed, and his hand curled slowly around the mug in his lap. He thought of his daughter, of how she might have looked had she lived to be Clara's age. The rage that simmered in his gut wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a low-burning fire. It didn't shake him, it centered him, gave him clarity. "What about lawmen?" he asked gently. "You tell anyone?" "They don't care," Clara said flatly. "Some of them are paid to look the other way. The ones that aren't, they're too far. No one believes girls like us when we talk. They just call us runaways or thieves. Easier that way." Her voice trembled, not with tears, but with tightly coiled fury. Thomas nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "I'm not the law, but I believe you." She looked at him across the cabin, her expression unreadable at first. Then something shifted, a small softening around the eyes. Not quite trust, but close. That night, he brought out a map. Spread it on the table beside the lantern. Clara leaned in, pointing with a trembling finger to a crooked stretch of river and a patch of unmarked woods. "There," she said, "that's where it is. A farmhouse with a barn, some outbuildings. They move around a lot, but that's where they had us last." He stared at the spot. He'd hunted in those woods once, years ago. Remote, easy to hide things. "How many men?" he asked. 5, maybe more. Some come and go. One of them's in charge. They call him Dane. Scar on his left cheek. Thomas folded the map slowly, setting it aside. "I ain't saying we go in shooting," he said, "but I need to know who we're up against. If they came this far, they'll come again." Clara nodded. "They will. Then we wait. But not idle." The next morning they began making preparations. Thomas reinforced the shutters, patched gaps in the walls, and set traps at the perimeter. Nothing lethal, just warnings. He showed Clara how to hold the revolver, how to aim it with both hands, steady. She was shaky at first, but her hands grew stronger by the hour. He gave her chores not to burden her, but to rebuild her confidence. Carrying water, chopping kindling, feeding the chickens. By dusk, her eyes held a flicker of pride. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing. And Thomas, who had once believed the world had nothing left to offer, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The girl who had collapsed at his gate was no longer a victim. She was preparing to fight. The sky turned the color of rust as the sun dropped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the prairie. Thomas was in the barn mending a fence post when the dog barked short, sharp, and low. Not the usual sound, not curious, not playful. It was a warning. He froze. From the shadows near the tree line, movement stirred, too smooth, too deliberate to be deer or cattle. He stepped into the doorway, eyes squinting through the dimming light. 4 riders emerged, slow, unhurried, silhouettes against the amber horizon. One of them dismounted and walked forward, rifle slung low on his hip. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the scar cutting across the man's cheek. Clara saw him too. She had come outside with the wash bucket in hand and dropped it instantly. Water splashed around her bare feet as her face drained of color. Her lips parted in a silent whisper. Dane. Thomas stepped in front of her. Inside, now she didn't argue. She backed toward the cabin and disappeared inside, locking the door as they had rehearsed. Thomas walked toward the front gate slowly, shotgun cradled in both hands. The wind stirred dry grass along the fence as the 3 remaining riders stayed mounted. Watching him, the man with the scar smiled, not kindly. "You've got something of mine," he called out. Thomas didn't blink. "You lost it in a storm. You don't get it back." The man chuckled, shaking his head like a parent amused by a stubborn child. "Look, old-timer, I don't want trouble. You hand the girl over, we're gone. No blood, no noise. I'm giving you a choice." Thomas's voice was steady. "I already made mine." There was a beat of silence. Then Dane's smile faded. His jaw tightened. "Fine," he said. "Have it your way." That's when it happened. Fast as lightning. One of the riders spurred his horse forward, pulling a pistol. But Thomas had already moved. He dropped to one knee and fired. The blast of the shotgun echoed across the prairie like thunder. The rider fell, his hat spinning into the dirt as the others scattered. From the cabin window, Clara fired the revolver. Just once. The shot hit a second rider's leg, and he screamed, falling from the saddle. The horses panicked, and one broke away entirely, bolting into the distance. Dane dove behind a tree stump, shouting orders. "Fan out. Get around him." Thomas moved with practiced calm, retreating toward the barn, using the fence as cover. Bullets whizzed past, splintering posts. The third rider, now on foot, tried to flank the cabin, but stepped directly into one of the traps Thomas had set. A rope snapped tight around his ankle, and he fell hard. Howling in pain, Clara stepped out the front door, with shaking hands but determined eyes, holding the revolver steady with both arms. She saw the trapped man writhing and aimed, but Thomas shouted, "Let him go." She froze, surprised, but obeyed. Thomas fired another shot toward the stump, forcing Dane to duck. "You came to the wrong place," he shouted. "This ain't your land, and she ain't yours." Dane cursed and crawled toward his wounded man, dragging him toward the brush. The surviving rider grabbed the reins of the injured one's horse and followed. One last glance from Dane over his shoulder, hatred in his eyes, and then they disappeared into the trees. Silence fell. Smoke drifted from Thomas's shotgun barrel. The air smelled of gunpowder, fear, and victory. Clara stood trembling at the porch steps, breathing hard. Her hands were still up, her face pale, but her eyes locked on Thomas. "You didn't kill them," she said quietly. "No," he answered. "Killing them wouldn't end it, but sending them limping back, that sends a message." She nodded slowly, lowering the revolver. "They'll be back." Thomas walked toward her, reloading his shotgun as he moved. "Then we'll be ready." That night, as the moon rose over the prairie and the barn stood watch like an old sentinel, they sat side by side near the fire. Not as strangers anymore. Not as runaway and rancher, but as survivors, unlikely allies bound by something stronger than blood. And though the darkness beyond the windows still held danger, the cabin pulsed with a quiet strength because for the first time in years, Thomas Raleigh wasn't alone, and neither was Clara.